going to spend the majority of our time in that text this evening, although we will refer to a few other passages along the way this evening as well. Matthew chapter 13. It is wonderful to be with you this weekend, to have my family here as well. And as Brother Rick mentioned, I do know a few of you from over the years. When we moved to Florida 15 years ago, we were in Orlando for about 10 years. The Dezerns were at Kissimmee, and at that time their kids were about the age that our kids are now. So I guess that's how life comes at you pretty quickly. And of course, at the South Miami congregation, where Ann's parents were working, and I was able to work with them. And in fact, I think it was about 13 years ago, when Bob and Arlene came up to help this group get started when you were in a community center, and Jan and I had the opportunity to even come up at that time. I was even going to make a joke about all the preachers' kids in attendance tonight and how you know there's going to be trouble and how Ann would probably be the worst one, but I decided not to make that joke. It probably wouldn't have gone over that well anyway. Wow, there are more people that I didn't even realize. I forgot the Hills are here, and I got the name right. Yeah, see, that's how well I know them. And of course the Ackett's as well. When we moved to Tampa, Randall and Alyssa were not yet, I don't think, even considering each other. But when Randall first introduced himself to me, he wanted to know if I would be able to help in an on-campus Bible study at USF. And Randall and Alyssa were the backbone of that study at their years at USF. So we think the world of them. It's great to be here with you. Matthew 28 contains what we refer to as the Great Commission. All authority has been given to me both in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. That commission is great for several reasons. That commission is great because it rests upon the greatest claim that there can be made. All authority has been given to me both in heaven and on earth. It is great because it has the highest of aims. The aim is not that we would be better than we once were, that we would be different even than the rest of the world or better than the rest of the world. The aim is that we would be true disciples of Christ, molded and fashioned in His image. And it has the greatest of scopes. Make disciples of all the nations. Now, those words of Jesus were given primarily to the apostles, and they had the primary obligation of going out and fulfilling what Jesus has said they must do. But you and I, we still look at that. We still take our motivation from that. When we are going out in our homes, in our communities, and even sometimes in our own families, the necessity of going and telling others about Jesus and of seeking to make disciples for Him. This topic was not my decision. Rick and Tip, we scheduled this meeting years ago, but within the last year, they said, we want you to focus on this idea of 21st century evangelism. I'm very appreciative of them for selecting this and for us to be able to consider that together this weekend. I am not coming to you with the how-to plan of how to go out and teach the lost. Because what I would do and where we are may not be what you need to do right here. But we are going to be looking at some very practical principles, I believe, that can aid us as we seek to evangelize the lost in a 21st century context. And that's what we need to consider this evening. This 21st century context, and I think many of us in our minds that we instantly think, okay, this means it's more difficult today. Because we live in a society where truth is relative, where pluralism is the gospel, and so why is anyone going to give a consideration to what we deem as absolute truth? Because the one who gave this said it is true, and it comes from the source of all authority. So we instantly think that, okay, we are up against something that's more difficult than it used to be. And so where we're going to start this evening is looking at how that's really not the case. 21st century evangelism, quite frankly, just isn't that different from first century evangelism. And of course, the reason why we're going to Matthew chapter 13 is this well-known parable, one that you already know. And I'm not going to necessarily try to point out things to you in the parable itself that will be new to you. But as we consider this and make some applications, let's read it together this evening. Matthew 13, we'll just go ahead and begin in verse 1. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea. And large crowds gathered to him, so he got into a boat and sat down. The whole crowd was standing on the beach. And he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate them up. Others fell in the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Others fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them out. And others fell on the good soil and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word. And the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom seed was sown in the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. There's an interesting setting even for the parable, and not the setting that we read of in Matthew chapter 13. The setting of the parable is that opposition is great. In Matthew, the 12th chapter, a passage we're going to go back to a little bit later in our lesson, we see just how great the opposition to Jesus has become. In verse 22, we read that a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute was brought to Jesus, and he healed him. So the mute man spoke and saw. And all the crowds were amazed and were saying, This man cannot be the son of David, can he? But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, This man cast out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. Here's how great the opposition has become. That because Jesus has not met their expectations and has not followed their traditions in the way that they think the Messiah would do, that now that Jesus is performing the very works of God, they look at these things and credit it to a demon. He can only work by the power of Beelzebul. Even later in the 13th chapter, later in the 12th chapter, passage many of us are familiar with in verse 46, that while he was still speaking to the crowds, behold, his mother and brothers were standing outside seeking to speak to him. And someone said to him, Behold, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak to you. But Jesus answered the one who was telling him and said, Who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, Behold my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus was not simply making the point in this passage of the greater Christian fellowship that was going to exist. He makes that point. But Jesus is actually looking at what his mother and brothers were doing. Mark chapter 3 and verse 21 tells us that his own people, i.e. his mother and his brothers, had gone out to apprehend Jesus because they had concluded he's out of his senses. They did not understand the mission of Jesus. They did not understand what he was doing and why he would engender so much conflict everywhere he had gone. So when Jesus' mother and brothers are outside and is told to Jesus, there's your mother and your brother, Jesus knows exactly why they are there. And so he says, you want to know who my real family is? It's these who want to do the will of my Father who is in heaven. It is a setting of opposition. And it's in that setting that Jesus gives this well-known parable, a parable about evangelism, of sowing the seed of the good news. Well, let's just consider a few things from this and looking at the soils in particular at first. We have what is referred to in the New American Standard as the road. I believe the ESV will list this as the path, wayside in a King James or New King James. And let's just understand what we're looking at here. We're not looking at a man who is just so careless that he goes out and here's this big road and I'm just going to throw seed on the road. There's no chance it would ever grow, but I'm just going to go out and throw seed. No, you live in these first century towns in Palestine and you go out to these plots that are cultivated. And of course, as in any case, in any rural agricultural setting, you would find that there are these natural paths that people have worn between the different fields. So here is a sower. He's following the path, going out to this area that he's going to be sowing. And as he's sowing, well, there, of course, some of the seed is going to fall on the road, or it's going to fall on the path or on the wayside. Well, that doesn't have a chance. And that doesn't have a chance because there are those who simply have made themselves blind to the truth. Jesus, of course, credits this to the deceiver, to Satan, who comes and snatches the word away. But of course, he does not remove the responsibility from those who failed to hear. The opportunity was there, but a willingness to see truth simply was not. And considering the 21st century context of evangelism, I think we believe, anyway, that our circumstances mean that there's just a lot more path or road. That there's just a lot more people out there who don't want to give the gospel a hearing at all. And we've got reasons that we have concluded this. We live in a subjective society, as I mentioned earlier. Some of you have read Gardner Hall's book, Conviction versus Mercy. If you have not, I would certainly recommend it. A wonderful read as we are seeking to think about how we can tell others about the truth today. But in that book, he relates at an episode from Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell is a very well-known Christian apologist, has been working on college campuses and just writing material for years. And the anecdote that he relates from Josh McDowell was early in his career when he would go, and he would even go on college campuses, typically not places that are that fond of Christianity, at least not in many of the departments anyway. And he would go and he'd try to tell people about Jesus and give evidence and give reason that they should believe. And of course, there were always those who did not believe. But the question early on was, how do you know this is true? How do you know what you're saying about Jesus is the truth? Give us some reason. Give us some evidence. More recently, the response that Josh McDowell gets when he goes out on college campuses is, are you saying that Muslims and Jews are wrong? Don't you think that's arrogant? It's no matter a matter of, is this true or not? And can you convince us that this is true? Now it is a matter of, you mean other people are wrong? How dare you possibly say that someone else is wrong? We find this more and more, even in religious circles. It's not just the world that has become subjective. We oftentimes have become subjective. There's a history of debating, even within our fellowship over the past many, many decades. Not all that history was great, but at least the point of a debate was, you tell me why you believe what you believe. I'm going to tell you why I believe what I believe. We're going to let the facts speak for themselves, and we'll come to a conclusion at the end. That's not the case in religious circles anymore. Now it's what is true for you, well, that's fine, and what is true for me. So again, we look at this and we conclude, well, we're dealing with a lot more road today. Then there's also the matter that there just seems to be fewer people interested in religion at all. The Barna Group ran a survey just a couple of years ago. Overall attendance from 2004 to 2014, so a span of a decade, 43% of Americans regularly attended church or some kind of religious service. 2014, that number had dropped to 34%. Regular attendance, the definition had changed even in that time period. Now, regular attendance was defined as once every 4 to 6 weeks. 2/5 of all Americans have not attended a religious service in the last 6 months, and more than half of the millennial and Gen X generations have not attended in the last 6 months. Well, that's not really news to any of us. We've seen that not only oftentimes in our own congregation, but we've just seen that in the world, in our neighborhoods, and the fact that there are just not many people who are going to quote-unquote church anymore. So we see that and we conclude, okay, people just are not as religious-minded anymore. They don't want religion. So we're dealing with more road. But the gospel came forth in the same kind of environment. The particulars aren't necessarily the same, but the fact was, in the first century, most people did not want the truth of the gospel. Most did not want it. The Jews rejected Jesus in spite of the evidence. Again, we've already noted Matthew 12, beginning in verse 22. Here, Jesus has performed a great work, something that only the Creator could do. He has made a man whole, and yet they reject the evidence. John chapter 11, of course, you remember, is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And even though they could not deny that a great deed had been done, the Jews wanted to merely cover it up because it did not fit with their idea of who the Messiah is and what He was coming to do. We think of Acts chapter 2 and we think of the 3,000 that obeyed the gospel at that time. Well, that 3,000 was a tiny minority, even of those who were in Jerusalem at that time. Most rejected it. Most did not want to hear of a man who came and proclaimed himself to be the Son of God. And you're saying, this is our Messiah, one who hung on a tree. And the Gentiles were certainly not primed to accept the gospel. And there were all kinds of barriers in the first century for the Gentile world to accept the gospel. And that's a fascinating thing when you read the book of Acts, and Paul, as he's going from place to place, and he goes first to the Jews, and there will be some who accept it, but for the very same reasons that the Jews in Palestine rejected Jesus, they reject Paul and his message about Jesus, and yet he turns to the Gentiles, and he has more success with them. But think what the Gentiles were up against. In your civic society, just to be engaged in society, well, that required almost idolatrous practices. That's really at the heart of what Paul has to say in a lot of the passages in 1 Corinthians. The things that they were dealing with to engage in commerce, to engage in politics, to engage in just normal civic life, which was a big deal to the Greeks. You were going to be engaged in idolatrous practices. It was just a given. But Christianity comes along and says, no, there is one God. Jesus reveals Him to us. And we need to follow Him and Him alone. It's not a culture primed for the gospel. What about the afterlife? Well, the Gentiles were not looking forward to the afterlife. Many, didn't think there was any such thing. And those that did had concluded that because, well, physical existence has its fair share of problems, we would like to think that the afterlife has nothing to do with a physical body. And yet the gospel rests on the fact that Jesus physically rose from the dead. And that He promises that one day we too are going to rise from the dead. You, of course, remember the response of the philosophers in Athens when they were hearing Paul speak about this in Acts chapter 17 and verse 32. They laughed, they mocked, they scorned the very notion of the resurrection from the dead. And then there was even the association in most Gentile cultures of Christians and the Jews. And the Jews, as they increasingly became frowned upon in Roman society, and the Christians were lumped up with them in many of their minds, so there was a less and less likelihood that people were going to listen to anything about Jesus, this Jew, this Nazarene. I say that simply to say, there's always been a lot of road. There's always been a lot of blindness to the truth. Different reasons for that in the 21st century as opposed to the first century. But there's always been a lot who just didn't even want to give the gospel a fair hearing. Well, moving on to the other soils. We have next what is referred to as the rocky ground. And this is those whom the cost is simply too great. Now, I do want us to caution here. Oftentimes when we look at this, I think we conclude that the wayside or the path of the road are those who just were never converted. The rocky ground and the thorny ground, they were at first converted and they fell away. I don't think that's actually what Jesus is saying here. They received the word at first with some joy, but I don't know that we're necessarily looking at converts who then fall away from Christ. No, they initially are receptive to what is said about Him and they're interested in this. But as I said, they have no root. They have no depth. Again, just understanding what was going on in this parable. I will confess to you, even though I'm from Alabama and growing up next to my grandparents, they had a garden. By the time I got big enough to do any of that, we didn't do a lot of farming. So I don't have a whole lot of experience in plowing and tilling and all those kinds of things. I do know, however, that unless you're going a decent amount of way down, you don't know what's underneath the soil. And you certainly would have known all the things that were underneath the soil in these little plots in Palestine. You're just trying to find every bit of usable ground that you can. And so you're throwing seed. There may be rock underneath that initial layer of soil. And that's exactly what happens here. There's initial reception, but it doesn't last. Jesus, in the explanation of the parable, says exactly why it does not last. In verse 20, this is the man who receives the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. Back in the 10th chapter, Jesus had already said there was going to be opposition. There was going to be resistance to the message of Him. He said in verse 34 of Matthew chapter 10, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it." In my community growing up, even though we did not see eye to eye about Jesus and about following Him, most people that I grew up with, they believed in Jesus. That was not an offensive thing to them. They might have thought some of the ways in which I followed Jesus and some of the things I would not do because I followed Jesus was ridiculous, but the idea of following Jesus was not offensive to them. Well, that wasn't true in first century Palestine. That wasn't true for those earliest Christians. That in point of fact, they did lose fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters and spouses. Because those who followed Jesus believed that this man, crucified by the Romans, that he rose from the dead and was the very Son of God. And most of their countrymen found that message repulsive. They deemed that message to be blasphemy. They deemed that message to be worthy of death. And so the individual that Jesus has in mind in the parable as he refers to the rocky soil is, here's someone who's interested. But when he considers what he would lose for following Jesus, the father, the mother, the brother, the sister, the spouse, well, that's just too much. That is too much. I think we're closer today to that kind of setting than we were perhaps whenever I was a kid. The idea of following Jesus is becoming increasingly repulsive in our society. The idea of basic morality and of right and wrong has become repulsive in our society. But we're back to where we were in the first century. There's always rocky ground. And so we may find some today who are interested in salvation. They're interested in what God would offer. But you mean to tell me that I have to say that what God says is sinful is sinful? And you mean to tell me that repentance, which we're going to talk about tomorrow night, is something that each one of us must do? We must change our ways? That's not a message tailor-made to our society. It simply is not. And so there will be those today, just like there were in the first century, for whom the cost of wearing the name of Jesus is just simply too great. What about the thorny ground? Jesus says again that these are those whom produce at first, or at least looks like they will. And I don't think, again, we're looking at converts per se, but those who have an interest in what Jesus has to say. But he says to them in verse 22, the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. These are the very things that Jesus had warned his disciples about back in the Sermon on the Mount. Go back in Matthew, the 6th chapter. You may remember that Jesus spoke about those two things, the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches. He covers the deceitfulness of riches first. Matthew 6, beginning in verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Here are those who are deceived by the things of this world. They think that the things they can work for and the things they can have, this is where my riches lie, and they are deceived by it. Later on, Jesus addresses worry, anxiety. And why are you worried about what you're going to wear? Why are you worried about the food that you're going to eat? And of course, his point is, the Gentiles, verse 32, seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Over a period of about 9 to 10 years, I made trips to Russia and the Ukraine every year. Worked with some very small churches that just don't exist anymore. I don't think any of them are in existence anymore. But the question that I would often get when I would return from those trips is, well, how are the problems different there than they are here? And after giving that some thought and some consideration, I concluded that the problems really aren't that different. Whereas in America, we've always been, let us have more, more, more. And what we're thinking of is better cars, bigger houses. In Russia, it's the same problem. We want more. More what? Well, just the basics. Maybe a house at all. We all struggle with these things, the deceitfulness of riches and the worry of this world. I don't have to tell you that when you consider the area of the country and the area of the world you're living in, this is the tailor-made point. We are all looking after the things of this world. We're deceived by it, or we're worried about it. That's where our time is going. That's where our energy is going. And Jesus says that is what chokes out the ability for us to produce fruit. There was thorny ground then, and there certainly is thorny ground today. But of course, Jesus said there was good soil. And simply put, that soil is defined in this way. They bear fruit. The deceitfulness of riches and the worry of the world prevented the seed in the thorny ground from bearing fruit. This, though, as Jesus says in verse 23, is the one in whom seed was sown, and the man who hears the word and understands it. And Jesus is not saying that the others could not, but here is a man who came to this with no presuppositions, with no prejudice against it. He hears it, he understands it, and he produces. This is good soil. And so what we must define good soil is simply not that we convert him, not that they become a Christian, but they produce fruit in their lives. They are producing for the Master now. Well, again, you have heard all of these things before, but let's just consider, as we're bringing this to a close tonight, some takeaways that we need to think about as we consider 21st century evangelism. The first is this. We just got to be reminded the world's never accepted Jesus. And it hasn't. Even when, again, when we think of the large numbers that were baptized in previous times, the world didn't accept Jesus. When we even think about our own country and our own society and where it seemed that people were just more religious, okay, well, that's probably true. Americans were more religious. But how many of us were just anxious to say, okay, let's open a Bible and make sure that what my religion is telling me, whatever my denomination or my preacher, pastor, whatever is telling me, that that's exactly what God said. No, America was a religious climate, but it wasn't necessarily, let's make sure that I'm following what God says as revealed in the New Testament. The world didn't accept Jesus then either. The world has never. Do you remember what John says of the Word that came into this world in John chapter 1? He came into this world that He made and He fashioned, and the world did not receive Him. The world of the first century did not receive Him. The world of the 21st century is not going to receive Him. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not opportunities to evangelize. It's just recognition of the fact that the world doesn't want Him. But of course, what we're interested in are those who want to come out of the world. Therefore, we have the gospel. We have what the world needs the most. Do you remember a little while ago, I mentioned those statistics from the Barna study about how we're becoming less religious and how people are going to church less? Well, there was interesting information that Barna shared as to exactly why people say they're not going to church. While almost 2/3 of those who value church attendance go to learn about God, fewer than 1 in 10, 6%, who have ever been to church say they learned something about God or Jesus the last time they attended. In fact, the majority of people, 61%, say they did not gain any significant or new insights regarding faith when they last attended. 6% said they learned something about God or Jesus the last time they attended church. And so we look at these things and we bemoan the fact that the world is becoming less and less religious. And what the statistics are saying is that, well, it was the church's fault. They weren't telling any people about what they need to know about. They need to know about God and they need to know about Jesus, and they weren't saying anything about Him. And in fact, one of the major culprits of why people are leaving mainline denominations is because the mainline denominations aren't different than the world anymore. They're becoming more and more secular. They're adopting more and more secular positions. And guess what? If the world is getting increasingly dark and the churches are becoming increasingly dark too, then there's no light. We have the gospel. That's what Jesus says. In fact, He refers to it in verse 19 as the word of the kingdom. And we have the assurance there are always those who want that. They want the kingdom. They want the security of God ruling in their lives. They want the security of knowing that they belong to Him. And we have the message that the King has come, and the King reigns on high, and the King will come again. We have the message that the world needs. So our job is to sow seed. The major point of the parable and why Jesus was even saying it or giving it to His disciples at that time was to make this point. You just go and you sow seed. You may think you know who's going to accept it. And again, those in Jesus' immediate vicinity would have thought, well, His mother and His brothers were prime candidates to accept the gospel. Well, at that time, at that moment, it would seem they were not. They certainly were later on, but at that moment, they were after Jesus to take Him home. They thought He had lost His mind. Do you think you know who's going to accept it? Do you think you know where the good soil is in the midst of all that rocky ground and thorny ground and wayside? No, you don't. No one would have pegged Paul. No one would have pegged most of the people that obeyed the gospel in the New Testament. And that's the point of the parable. You just sow seed. It's not my job, it's not your job to predetermine who will accept it, who will be interested in it. We have the job to go and to tell them about Jesus. Now, the question becomes, how do we go about doing this? And again, this is not where I'm going to get super practical and let you know exactly how we do it. We have an interesting church environment where we are. Our building is in a very depressed area. And we've just got people moving in left and right all the time. We've got students who are moving in left and right all the time. We get people just coming into our building all the time from the community. And oftentimes they're just wanting to hear some kind of good news. So we get a lot of opportunities just from that. So if I were to say, oh, wait, just adopt what we do at university, I'd just say, well, just open the door and they're going to come in the door. I don't know that's necessarily what's going to work for you here. But there are certainly some things that we can do. Throughout history, people have used whatever means were available to them. If you read the history of the Reformation, which not that any of you necessarily want to, but it's pretty interesting. And one of the main reasons the Reformation got going on in the days of Martin Luther was the printing press had been invented. And so you could disseminate ideas in ways you could never disseminate them before. Many of you, in fact, you could even go out there now. You go out and there's a tract rack. Well, tracts used to be a major way in which people would share ideas of the gospel with people. Here, you got a minute? Here, read this. It used to be we would go, not me, I'm a little too young for this, but we'd go door knocking, door to door. Let's knock on doors. Let's see if we can set up some studies, or we'll have a personal invite. We'll do some Jewel Miller film strips on a Friday night. We'll have people come over and we'll watch these. And all those things worked. They worked for a time because it was what people would respond to. What's going to work here? What's going to work in the setting and the culture in which you live? And when people are pressed for time, or as Randall even said to me today, time is the most precious commodity that anyone out in this area has. Well, I guess that's true of all of us, but certainly you think of people and they're driving to work, and then they work all day and they're driving forever to get home. And how can you possibly evangelize today? Well, we do the same thing we've always been doing. We use whatever means is available to us. Personal invites are still very important. We're going to talk more about that on Sunday. But to personally invite someone, whether it be to a class at home or to a Bible study, or you know that Jerome is going to be preaching a lesson 2 Sundays from now, and it's going to be about this, and you think I've got a friend who's going to be interested in that, then yes, that is the best way still, and has always been, let me invite someone. But you've got other means at your disposal too. You know, social media has its knocks, and certainly it's got plenty of them. Technology and email and all these kinds of things of what we can do is sharing ideas, of sharing information. We ought to avail ourselves to all of those things. Why? It's because the things we have now. And it's the platforms we have now. Now, those things have some limitations. Social media is not going to convert anybody. That's not how it works. It's not its purpose. You don't convert people simply because you posted things on Twitter or Instagram. That's not how it happens. You can garner some interest from social media. And again, we'll talk more about that on Sunday. You can get someone interested in a topic or an idea, or maybe plug something that's going to be going on. That certainly has value. You can email sermon links or other material to people that you know addresses something they're specifically going on, and that has value, but it may not answer all the questions that they have. So ultimately what all this comes down to, and has always come down to, it has to be a point in time where with a Bible, I'm with someone and we're talking about the gospel. And again, we're going to talk more about that the rest of this week. Sunday morning, I hope to give some practical lessons that I use whenever I get the opportunity to finally just sit down with someone over a Bible. And we talk about faith. But that's ultimately where we've got to get to. We sow seed in whatever way we can. Whatever way this congregation can think to sow seed, that's exactly what you need to be doing. Mass mail-outs to the community. They were talking about the apartment buildings around the area, and there's going to be these pamphlets that are even given in the information that people get when they move in. All that is great. But ultimately we get down to the fact that we share with them the gospel. But we also must recognize this. When we think about sharing the gospel, we think about, okay, I've got to say things, I've got to speak to them. Well, we've got to get to that point. But go back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 13, after Jesus has described the citizens of the kingdoms with the Beatitudes, and he says in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." How do I sow seed? Well, first I live the gospel. I transform my nature into what Jesus described in those Beatitudes. And then when I'm around people and they're struggling and they're going through things and they see hope in me and they see a difference in me, well, I live the gospel. We do live in an increasingly dark world. It's getting darker and darker outside all the time. And what you need in a dark world, in a dark place, is just one little point of light. And people that want to get out of darkness will go toward it. I've got to sow seed. I've got to know what the gospel is so I can share it, but I've got to live the gospel so that I can gather interest in it. And ultimately, we entrust that God will give the increase. In a different parable spoken by Jesus, in Mark the 4th chapter, Jesus returns to this same kind of scenario about a man who goes out and he plants seed. In Mark 4, beginning in verse 26, Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is like a man who casts seed upon the soil. He goes to bed at night and gets up by day, and the seed sprouts and grows. How he himself does not know. The soil produces crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, then the mature grain in the head. When the crop permits, he immediately puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come." We trust that God gives the increase. And if there's ever a how-to lesson on how to evangelize that doesn't mention prayer, then we've missed the boat. Because ultimately, I don't know how anyone's going to accept the gospel. But God gives the increase. And it's not up to me to understand how anyone is going to accept the gospel. What I need to do, what we all need to do, is be diligent about our role in sowing seed and then praying that even though we don't know how or we don't even know when, that ultimately our God is going to cause that seed to grow and He will give the increase. It may be that there are even those with us tonight that seed has been growing in you. The message of the gospel has been one of importance to you, and you've been thinking about it, and you've been considering it, and you're ready to respond to that message. There have no doubt been people praying for you. And God desires to bring about that increase in your life. So if we can help you, whether that be even baptizing you in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, or whether that be praying with you and for you, because of things that have been going on in your life and you've not been as fruitful and productive for the Lord as you know you should be. Let us aid you. And if we can help you, won't you come as we stand and as we sing.